I was a nurse for over 22 years in the field of psychiatry.
A supervisor said, "Oh, you're on the ECT rotation next week." And I said, "Oh, well, what do I do?"
The idea is that the shock will subdue the unwanted emotions. In fact, all it ended up with was brain damage.
I underwent electroshock therapy from the ages of 14 to 16.
And I can remember saying, "Why? Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me?"
If this is a hospital, why are you locking the doors?
This is about making money at the expense of vulnerable people in our society.
It's one of the most barbaric treatments that the world has ever known.
I don't remember anything anymore. It's too late.
If I ask you, what is ECT or electroconvulsive therapy, what do you say?
I have no idea.
I don't know. I have no clue.
I don't know.
I don't know the acronym, but I'm assuming you're talking about like electroshock therapy.
I think I've seen it in movies.
It's a pretty bad reputation, and it's generally frowned upon nowadays.
Outdated. I don't think they really use that anymore.
It is considered an antiquated technique.
Barbaric.
Brutal.
Some say it was extremely traumatizing.
Did you know they're still doing electroshock?
I really did not know that this was actually still happening.
Oh, they're still doing it? Why?
Can't believe that it's still allowed.
I thought it was against the law.
Of all of psychiatry's inhumane practices, one of the most cruel and barbaric is electroconvulsive therapy.
People often ask, what is electroshock? And what it is electrocution. That's all it is. They don't call it electrocution. They call it electroconvulsive therapy because it has a magic three-letter acronym, ECT. And the one thing it isn't is therapy.
ECT involves applying electrodes to a patient's scalp and then passing an electrical current through the skull and the brain tissue in order to induce a seizure.
Psychiatrists shoot up to 460 volts of raw electricity through the skull to deliberately create a seizure that can last up to half an hour.
It is ultimately imparting large amounts of electricity, many times the voltage you would get even if you stuck your finger into a light socket.
In fact, ECT uses enough voltage to run 2 elevators, drive a shipping crane, or power 5 stadium lights.
This is an electroconvulsive therapy machine, also called a shock machine. The purpose of this instrument is to run an electric current through the head of a patient. These are the 2 electrodes. The machine applies a voltage to these 2 electrodes, and that causes a current to flow through the patient's brain, and that constitutes the treatment. So if we set this dial to 100%, then this instrument is set to pass 3 billion electrons through the patient's head during one treatment.
ECT machines generate nearly 430 times the electrical current of a stun gun. The machines themselves are quite basic. They pull electricity into a capacitor, an energy-storing device that allows the machine to hold over 4 times what a wall socket can deliver. At the push of a button, psychiatrists shoot this massive payload of high-voltage electricity directly through the skull. The brain, however, is an extremely delicate instrument, made up of approximately 100 billion neurons. It interprets and relays countless signals necessary for control of the body, more than 5 trillion signals per second. The brain is powered by less than 0.2 of a volt of electricity. That's nearly 8 times less than a watch battery. Compare that to the potential voltage shot through the brain in a single shock treatment. 2,300 times the electricity the brain uses to function. It's as forceful as being punched in the face by a prize fighter.
And the outcome of that is it destroys brain cells. And the more brain cells you destroy, in theory, the better it is for the person. The biggest mystery of all is why on earth people think that putting bolts of electricity through people's heads is a good idea.
Psychiatrists shock patients to create what they call a therapeutic seizure. But there's no such thing.
When we're in emergency departments and someone comes in with a seizure, that is a bona fide emergency, and we hop right to and try to stop the seizure immediately and its side effects and the things that it causes.
A seizure is a sudden electrical discharge in the brain, causing alterations in behavior, sensation, or consciousness. Seizures can be the result of a medical condition, like epilepsy, or caused by outside forces.
There are seizures that are fever-induced, or if it's alcohol withdrawn, or if it is caused by hallucinogens or by cocaine or methamphetamine. Those things, when the patient stops using them, they improve.
But in ECT, psychiatrists produce seizures in their most serious form. These are called grand mal seizures, and they are caused by abnormal electrical activity throughout the entire brain.
Okay, grand mal seizure is when you go unconscious and have a lot of spasmodic muscular contractions which can hurt you, and you can often lose control of your bladder and bowels.
They could stop breathing, they could bite their tongue, arch their back to such an extent as to cause a fracture of the spine. It's just a complete disorganization of neurologic function where a person has no control over their body.
The more seizures a person has, the more potential there is for cognitive decline, different neurologic dysfunctions, and more seizures.
Having recurrent seizures potentially reduces the lifespan of that individual. It has an impact on mortality.
Each year, 45,000 Americans die from seizures, as many as die in traffic accidents.
You know, mainstream physicians go to great lengths to prevent seizures. Epilepsy, seizure disorder, is a medical problem that we give medication for in order to prevent any seizures, not just some seizures. The idea is to prevent seizures, to prevent brain damage, because it's recognized that seizure activity promotes brain damage.
Yet this is what shock doctors claim is therapeutic. And so they cause grand mal seizures on purpose.
I became part of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, which is an international watchdog investigating psychiatric abuses, because I've had shock treatment. I know the damage that it caused. I know what damage it did, not just to me, but to my family who had to get me through that. You know, when I was very young, I felt depressed, but what I didn't know is that I actually had an underactive thyroid. I was sent to a psychiatrist by my GP, and he said, well, you need shock treatment. The shock is like a grenade going off in the body. The violence of this, it's like every nerve and every cell is being electrified and with such force. And you come out of it and you know that that body is never going to be the same again. When I woke up, I was so disjointed. I didn't know where I was. I was in an incredible amount of pain. And I looked at this person standing next to my bed, and I didn't know who it was. I said, well, who are you? And she said, I'm your mother. Electroshock is torture being passed off as therapy. It is a betrayal.
How do psychiatrists get away with this barbaric treatment? Their history is littered with them. In the 1920s, psychiatrist Manfred Sokal claimed that he could successfully treat mentally ill patients by killing bad brain cells. In reality, he created brain-damaging seizures using insulin, which killed 5% of all patients and turned others into imbeciles. Hungarian neuropsychiatrist Ladislaus Meduna claimed he could drive out mental illness by inducing brain-damaging seizures with a powerful drug called metrazole. But that too failed.
Since its inception, psychiatry has really had 4 modalities of treatment that they recircle over and over again. Cut it, burn it, drug it, shock it to the human mind. So when one of their treatments fails, they use it to promote the next one.
In the wake of the damage caused by metrazole, psychiatrists jumped to the prefrontal lobotomy as their newest miracle cure. Using ice picks to shred the brains of their patients, psychiatrists created tens of thousands of human vegetables, until fierce opposition forced psychiatrists to abandon this monstrous procedure. Meanwhile, they had already turned to a new breakthrough: electricity.
Ugo Cerletti wrote in his own documents that he was inspired to develop electroshock by his observation of pigs being led to slaughter. And he saw that the effect of shock on these pigs was to make them more docile and controllable, and it made them not even fight for their own survival.
For the next 2 years, Cerletti conducted experiments with electric shock on a variety of animals.
Cerletti progressed to taking homeless people off the street and subjecting them to electric shock.
According to Cerletti himself, his first human victim, a homeless man, begged him not to be shocked again. Cerletti's colleague, psychiatrist Lothar Kalinowski, witnessed the horrors of that first procedure, as his wife recalled.
He came home for lunch, as white as a sheet, and said, "Today I saw something terrible." And he described the first electric shock treatment, and he ended with, "I never want to see this again."
Despite the obvious damage psychiatrists were causing with electroshock, they soon spread the lucrative procedure throughout Europe and the United States. By the 1940s, electroshock was in widespread use and in its crudest form.
The original idea was that you would invoke a convulsion. And of course, by definition, if you're having a convulsion, your body is jerking. The problem was that people's bodies were jerking so much, they were breaking their shoulders, they were breaking their necks, bones were being broken.
But that didn't stop psychiatrists from merchandising this brutal procedure to the public.
Many patients have been returned to their homes and jobs who might still be here if it were not for this helpful form of treatment.
ECT has been around since I was a medical student, and I graduated from medical school 60 years ago this year. I considered it, as a medical student, having observed a few of them, I guess the kindest thing I could say is barbarian. I thought it was truly one of the most obnoxious things I'd ever seen done to a human being. A huge percentage of these people have brain damage.
By the 1950s, the brain damage electroshock caused became too much to ignore. So psychiatrists spun it to their advantage.
Experts like Walter Freeman would say that the reason that ECT works is because it causes brain damage.
Maybe it will be shown that a mentally ill patient can think more clearly and more constructively with less brain in actual operation.
And that was the stated goal: less brain.
In the 1940s and the 1950s, it was very open in the medical literature that the way electroshock, quote, worked was by brain damage. And yet they went on to say that this was somehow going to end up being beneficial for the patient, when all it really ended up with was brain damage.
That marketing angle changed abruptly in 1975, when the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest exposed the brutality.
The movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest forever changed the course of the public's perception of electroshock therapy because it was so accurately portrayed in the film. It was so obviously torture.
With shock finally under public scrutiny, news organizations began documenting its human toll.
Just like it's true that you can chemically control someone, yes, you can electrically shock someone out of their so-called crazy mind, but you don't shock them back into their right mind. You shock them into a shocked mind.
Even the recognized grandfather of electroshock in the USA acknowledged its damage.
The principal complications of ECT are death, brain damage, memory impairment, and spontaneous seizures.
Gonna do another one, Paul? I think so. Geez, these are short seizures.
In the face of public outrage, psychiatrists came up with a new miracle cure: psychotropic drugs. But these too proved ineffective and dangerous and amounted to a chemical lobotomy. Psychiatrists had an answer: to recycle and repackage electroshock.
Electroshock was so abhorrent to the American public that psychiatry came up with a PR campaign to change its name to electroconvulsive therapy. But it is not therapy. It has never been therapy.
To cover up the damage, shock doctors added anesthesia and paralyzing agents to suppress their patients' writhing convulsions. They marketed ECT as modern and are still doing so today.
Well, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT today, is nothing like what you've seen in the movies. It's a modern medical procedure.
Modern ECT is a lot better than old-fashioned ECT.
It doesn't look at all barbaric now.
But beneath the sales spiel, electroshock is every bit as brutal as it always has been. And the result remains the same: a grand mal seizure and brain damage. The only thing that has changed is the marketing.
I was a psychiatric nurse for 22 years, and I worked at a facility that did ECTs on adults. I became a whistleblower because I saw things that were being done to patients that were wrong, were unlawful, unethical. We used to tell our patients who would go in for ECT, things are not the same as they used to be back in the 1950s. And at the consultation, we would give out these videos called Shock. And our overall pitch to patients was, we don't know how it works. We just know that it does. We would compare it to rebooting a computer. The patients were led to believe this was somehow or another a miracle. And it wasn't a miracle. I didn't see any miracles, and I was in the business.
A business in which ECT machines have always created brain damage.
Here we have two electroconvulsive therapy machines. This one is from the 1940s, and this one is a much more modern machine from the 2000s. They both have the same potential to do damage to the brain by running large amounts of electricity through the brain cells with the risk that cells will be damaged or killed.
Yet ECT promotional videos feature psychiatrists pitching exactly the opposite.
ECT is the gold standard treatment for that type of depression. It's a small amount of current. It's nothing like what's in the outlet at home, okay?
This is a typical and widely promoted lie. Unlike ECT machines, wall outlets are not designed to shock people. In the United States, they feature safety fuses that cut off the current at 6/1000ths of an ampere, a unit measuring the strength of an electric current. Modern ECT machines, however, deliver between 800 to 900 1,000ths of an ampere, up to 150 times the legal limit set to protect against electrocution. And that's what goes through the heads of ECT patients.
I was only 24 years old, and I didn't have anything except what you call the baby blues. My hormones were completely messed up after having a child. My husband was told that the best way to handle this was take me to a psychiatrist. And the next thing I know, they have me in a hospital, and they shocked me. And you would just wake up not knowing where you are or how you got there. And they would send me back, and they would just continue to do this over and over and over and over again. You just got shocked whether you wanted to be shocked or not. They just have to keep hitting your head with that hammer. They gave me 28 shock treatments. They took my soul, my mind, my intellect, my emotions. They put electricity to it. They ran it through my head and literally raped my soul.
ECT's modern repackaging comes with more dangers than just the electricity.
The drug they use as a relaxant in the US before you receive electroshock is also the drug they use for lethal injections.
This drug is called succinylcholine. It paralyzes all the muscles of the body except for the heart. Due to its effectiveness in stopping breathing, it's a drug regularly used in the execution of prisoners on death row. Psychiatrists use it for electroconvulsive therapy.
The same drug that's used to kill the person in the execution by paralyzing his breathing also paralyzes his breathing during the shock treatment, which is why the anesthesiologist actually has to ventilate the patient during the procedure. Same drug, same effect.
Modern electroshock is being given under sterile conditions in a regular operating room, looking very much like a regular medical operation, and it's all much more acceptable to anybody who would observe it. In fact, the literature shows that electroshock given under general anesthesia may even be more brain damaging than electroshock as it was given before.
The reason? The anesthetic and paralyzing drugs actually raise the seizure threshold, requiring an increased intensity of electric current to produce a seizure. And the more ECT treatments a patient gets, the higher their threshold. So, psychiatrists crank up the electricity even further each time. This causes brain damage, whether the patient is under sedation or not.
When you give a shock treatment and you give the anesthesia, it does nothing to protect their brain. So you can only protect their body while you're destroying their mind.
It's like this. If you are awake and get hit with a baseball bat, it's obvious that we would feel a lot of pain. But if you're unconscious and get hit with a baseball bat, your body goes through that same trauma. So why are we acting as if in our society that the body doesn't go through trauma just because somebody is conscious or not conscious?
Early shock doctors used 80 volts of electricity, minuscule compared to what is dispensed by today's ECT machines. In fact, one machine manufacturer recommends that psychiatrists increase the electrical dosage up to 6 times what's needed to produce a seizure.
We have here a Spectrum 4000 ECT machine, which is a modern device. It's connected to 2 resistors here, which is typical of the resistance that a patient's head would present to an ECT machine. I'm going to hit the treat button, and we'll be able to see if there's any temperature rise using the heat gun. I'll press the treat button. 112, 118, 120. So, We see that the current that the ECT machine forced through these resistors caused them to heat up from approximately 75 degrees to 120 degrees. The cells can get too hot, they can be damaged, or even die.
If you look at the MRI of their brain, they have areas that have disappeared. They're wasting away, just like somebody with Alzheimer's.
It's the result of being hit with up to 450 times the current of a cattle prod. But for many, the damage is far more than physical.
Every time I look in the mirror, I try to wonder who I am. Just try to kind of put the pieces together of who I used to be. I started an antidepressant, and then it just multiple cocktails of drugs, of antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety pills, sleeping medication, stimulants. And I just deemed treatment resistant. And then at 21, I was given electroshock. I went through a neurocognitive testing 6 months after, and I lost approximately about 50 points of IQ. My IQ is measured at 78, which I think that 75 is rendered mentally retarded. It's a constant identity crisis that I deal with. I do consider shock treatment torture because it damaged me physically and mentally in every way, and it's just continue. It's like every day I'm reliving the shock because I don't know who I am. They say that it's safe and effective, but I think I'm living proof that it's not.
Psychiatrists are in no position to claim that ECT is safe or effective because their knowledge of its very basics is sorely lacking.
Electrical engineers understand how electricity works, and biomedical engineers understand the effects that electric currents can have on human tissue. Psychiatrists, however, typically don't receive the kind of training to make them understand electricity, what it is, what it does, what it can do to the human body. So we have in this case an operator who is merely trained to set the knobs and push the buttons without understanding the ramifications of what he's doing.
A shock doctor examined in a court of law on his training on electricity proved the point.
What is an amp?
What is an amp? It's been a long time since high school physics, and I couldn't give you a scientific definition of what an amperage is.
Do you have a definition of a volt?
A volt. A volt might be the power at which an amperage is pushed through an electrical wire.
You're not quite sure what these terms mean, are you?
I'm not quite sure.
One of the settings that you put on your dials on your machine is hertz, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you know what the term hertz actually means?
I don't.
Do you tell your patients about your level of understanding of the resistance of the brain to the electricity you're sending through it?
No.
Do you think they might want to know before they lay their head down on the operating table to have you give them shock treatment?
No one's ever asked.
Prior to his testimony, Dr. Joseph Johnson had delivered over 1,800 shock treatments. But Dr. Johnson is not alone in being woefully ignorant of the basic principles and terms of electricity. The curricula in psychiatric training schools contain little on the subject. And psychiatrists will admit they know nothing about how their so-called treatment works.
Electroshock is as much art as science because how it works is still a mystery.
Do you know how it works, Jonathan?
I don't think anybody really knows how it works.
There's no specific answer to that question.
People don't understand why this works or how it works.
How does it work? Well, as a field, we are focusing on researching that question.
We don't really know, is what you're saying.
We don't have the complete answers. However, it's not a complete cure.
How psychiatrists get away with this is another mystery.
a cardiologist, orthopedic surgeons, other physicians in other specialties really just couldn't get away with using tools of their trades with knowing so little about it as shock doctors do about what they're doing.
And yet, psychiatrists do get away with it every time they deliver this procedure.
Psychiatrists will tell you that they don't know exactly how ECT works, but what they do know is that it causes brain damage, organ failure, it can kill someone, it can cause seizures. They do know that much, but they can't tell us how it actually works.
Shock psychiatrist Richard Abrams, co-owner of ECT machine maker Somatics, has admitted to his own ignorance under oath.
Do you have any understanding as to the mechanics of how ECT works?
I do not.
All right. Would you agree that that's the general state of the industry still today? That the practitioners of ECT don't have an understanding of how it works?
That's correct.
This same Richard Abrams wrote the standard textbook on ECT. This same psychiatrist who admits to knowing nothing about how ECT works wrote a textbook that appears to be scientific and authoritative, while manufacturing ECT machines and selling them all over the world. Meanwhile, the practitioners of ECT use these machines to wallop their victims with more voltage than an industrial printing press.
They see that as their job. Give the patient the drugs and they push the red button and zap him. But they don't study the underlying science because there isn't any.
My personal experience as a psychiatry resident was I was doing a rotation. All of a sudden my supervisor says, "Oh, you're on the rotation for ECT next week." And I said, "Oh, well, what do I do?" I've had no training, no instruction whatsoever. I arrive at the room, I walk in, there's the anesthetist, there's the nurse, there's the equipment, the patient's wheeled in, and now I have to set the settings on the machine. So I look at the log and I say, "Oh, well, the last time this person had a treatment, the settings were this and this." So I adjust the dials, person gets treated. Next patient who comes in, it's their first course of ECT, the very first treatment. So there's nothing in the logbook. So then I go, I guess I'll just do halfway in between the last two patients. Set the dials, off we go. That's literally the experience I had. No supervision, no follow-up, nothing.
Even long-term shock doctors don't know how much electricity will produce a seizure in a new patient. It's just trial and error. Take Charles Kellner, a prominent ECT psychiatrist who showcased this on national TV.
Preparing the sites for the electrodes for the delivery of the stimulus. Okay, treating. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Still didn't get it? Got it. Okay. Now she's having a seizure.
Half an hour after her seizure, Terry is in recovery.
Your treatment went really well. I want you to know that, okay?
The very next day, Terry is back.
Do you recognize me? No, I'm Dr. Kellner.
Inflicting a patient with 3 brain-damaging shocks in a row is not just an assault. ECT cripples everyone who undergoes it. As one of shock's most zealous supporters, psychologist Harold Sackheim stated under oath,
Altered cognition is the most common side effect of ECT. That memory loss occurs, it's universal, and in some individuals it can be profound.
Altered cognition is no light matter. It means a fundamental worsening of the highest centers of brain function, controlling emotional awareness, self-insight, judgment, and memory. And loss of memory is the first thing ECT victims notice.
wasn't until I was at Shoal Creek that I saw a psychiatrist. And little did I know, after I signed myself in freely, that I couldn't leave for 72 hours. I wouldn't leave my room. I couldn't be around other people. I was terrified, and every time I went for another treatment of ECT, I got more and more paranoid. My head was exploding for days. I couldn't do anything but fall on the bed and sleep for 16 hours or something. I'd have to write everything down and then remember where I wrote it. My family would tell me, look at your book. Look at your book. I had to carry this book around with me all the time. My first service dog I got because if I left the apartment to go check the mail, I would get lost. I couldn't remember the number of the apartment. I'd just wander around. When I applied for disability, I had to go to the office and take some kind of test. I couldn't tell them my name. I couldn't tell them where I lived. I couldn't tell them how to get to my house. I couldn't tell them the president. I couldn't tell them anything. And my older sister told me that they asked her, is she like this all the time? And she said, pretty much.
I spent 30 years working in the psychiatric system, principally as a clinical psychologist. And during that time, I saw numerous patients who'd received electroshock. I spoke with numerous psychiatrists who delivered electroshock. And it was really after that I became kind of intrigued as to what was going on and why were these people delivering it. And more to the point, why did so many of my patients have long-term memory problems? There's a thing called anterograde amnesia, which is you lose your memory for everything after the shock, so you don't create new memories. And then there's retrograde amnesia, which is you lose memories for things immediately before the shock.
There's only been a few studies done in the last 33 years on permanent amnesia over the long term, 6 months or greater. And what they found, when they look for it, they find it. But they tend just not to look for it.
They knew about permanent memory loss a long time ago, and they actually instructed the field to say that it wasn't permanent, that it wasn't long-term, to use words such as transient, words such as spotty, words such as temporary, to minimize these adverse events.
But outside their clinics, psychiatrists will freely confess that memory loss is a prominent feature of ECT.
Clearly there are risks with ECT. That's been well established for a long time. Some people have regretted doing it because of memory impairment.
Memory loss occurs when patients get electroconvulsive therapy.
The amnesia problem with memory.
They have some memory problems that persist more than we'd like.
While someone's going through ECT, they have pretty profound memory loss.
Sometimes, they can impact the patient pretty severely.
It's like a little volcano inside the brain.
You get more bang for your buck with ECT. If you pardon the pun, you know.
But shock psychiatrists rarely make such candid confessions to their patients.
The industry has variously represented that ECT's benefits exceed its disadvantages. They don't deny that there are disadvantages to ECT, they minimize them. It's a sales pitch.
And it's pitched by PR firms who provide talking points to media-trained psychiatrists.
ECT is the fastest and most effective treatment that we have.
It's the most effective treatment that we have today for severe depression.
The single most effective treatment we have for depression.
It is the most effective
really
treatment.
Effective for depression. It's
ECT
more effective
is
than
more
medication.
effective than antidepressant
More effective than many of the psychotropic
ECT
medications.
remains number one.
More than medication, more than therapy, more than ketamine.
One of the most effective treatments for anything in medicine.
But their parroted lines are spin, not science.
Shock psychiatrists blame all kinds of adverse effects of ECT on the patient or their underlying mental condition. For example, memory loss or inability to make executive decisions are blamed on the person's underlying depression when it's actually an effect of the ECT.
In addition to inflicting head injury, ECT can cause damage throughout the body.
That's why when you get ECT,
there's a crash cart there in case the heart goes into an abnormal rhythm. And if that happens, the doctors have that there in order to bring the person back to life.
Despite case after case of documented damage caused by ECT, psychiatrists dismiss these reports as anecdotal. They also ignore their own studies, demonstrating that there is no value to ECT.
Sham ECT is basically placebo control, where the person's wheeled into the room, they're put to sleep, electrodes are put on their head, buttons pushed, but there's no electricity. And so the patient doesn't know if they got real or sham. There's only 12 or 13 of those kind of studies ever. And when you pool them together, there is absolutely no evidence anywhere that people who've had ECT are better off 1 month later.
But those who submit to real ECT frequently get caught up in the shock industry's treadmill.
Just like with psychiatric drugs and in the psych hospital, they keep coming back. We used to call them frequent flyers. They would be readmitted, readmitted, readmitted. We see the same patients coming in and out, in and out.
But psychiatrists like Sarah Lisenby blame the patient for relapsing rather than the treatment for failing.
Is without a maintenance treatment, you can have rapid relapse, but with maintenance treatment, you can have sustained relapse prevention.
Can I ask you, Dr. Lisenby, what you think the minimum length of time is that is required to demonstrate an effect of the device?
Well, I guess I'm saying that, I guess I'm trying to answer by analogy. ECT is an effective intervention without any form of relapse prevention. Patients will relapse very quickly.
The facts about what psychiatrists call relapse are these. The brain trauma caused by ECT is significant, equivalent to the force of dropping a 40-pound cinder block 7.5 feet onto the head. To heal this catastrophic damage, the brain releases chemicals which cause a sense of euphoria. But this quickly dissipates, and the person's problems return, often with a vengeance. And when that happens, psychiatrists prescribe more ECT. They call it maintenance, continuation, or booster ECT.
The nature of depression is that it is usually a relapsing illness.
Regular recurring ECT treatments may be needed.
Many people often go on to get what's called maintenance.
Ongoing maintenance therapy is provided.
And then you need another 10 ECT.
This is going to be a repeated pattern of these people are going to be on courses of treatment that will last for the rest of their lives.
And, you know, the average today is about 35 treatments of shock every year. And of course, it doesn't work, it just makes them worse and it damages.
Psychiatrists and ECT machine makers Richard Abrams and Conrad Swartz admitted to this lack of result in a letter to the FDA. It is not surprising that evaluations performed weeks or months after completion of the acute ECT treatment course usually fail to show a significant advantage for ECT. ECT doesn't just cause brain damage and destroy body function. It can also be fatal.
It can make people suicidal, either just contemplating suicide or actually going out and taking their lives.
The man who left an indelible impression on English literature is dead. Ernest Hemingway died of a self-inflicted wound at his Ketchum, Idaho home.
Nobel Prize-winning author Ernest Hemingway committed suicide shortly after being subjected to a series of electric shocks. Before his death, he stated, "What is the sense of ruining my head and erasing my memory, which is my capital, and putting me out of business?" It was a brilliant cure, but we lost the patient.
And we know that by doing ECT, the suicide rate, you're 13 times more likely to commit suicide if you do the ECT than if you had never done it.
I was bullied at school, being abused at home. So then, the doctor tells me, well, we want to try a new treatment with you. She's like, we call it ECT. I was 17 years old when I received ECT for the first time. Here I am, I'm a scrawny 110-pound kid, and you got these guys that are like ex-military UFC-looking fighters just grabbing me, throwing me in a room, and stabbing me with an injection, putting leather restraints on my arms. Then all I remember is waking up in my room. My head felt like it was on fire. It was like the worst headache I've ever had. And then I started panicking because I didn't know who I was. I don't remember my name. I don't remember anything. I don't remember what happened the day before. It was, I didn't just remember anything at all. When I came back, I wasn't used to my home, my neighborhood, nothing. And the next 4 years, I blanked. And it got to the point where I got fed up with it. So I took like half of my Prozac and I just, put it in my mouth, put myself like a self-induced coma. I remember I was just in my bed all day, cutting myself, trying drowning myself, hanging myself, thinking of ways I could end my life, putting a plastic bag around my head, tying it, and going under my blankets, just waiting to die already. Even to this day, I'm still suicidal. I mean, if you don't care about your memories or your life or anything like that, oh yeah, go ahead, do it. If you love pain, you love headaches and all that, yeah, go do it. But if you want to remember your life, you want to remember your friends and all the good times, yeah, don't do it.
One of the dangers of ECT is death. That's known. It's actually reported in MedWatch reports in the FDA. You had a death that occurred to a patient just hours after they received ECT. So, does ECT cause death? Yes, it does.
Researchers at Brown University looked at the effect of ECT in the elderly. They looked at depressed elderly patients who were given ECT and compared them to depressed elderly patients who got usual medical treatment. And they found that the death rate after just 1 year among the ECT recipients was 27%, compared to an over 96% survival rate among the people who were treated without electric shock.
In other words, senior citizens who received ECT died at over 6 times the rate of those who did not receive it.
So one of the demonstrations I like to do with ECT is show the difference in the amount of electricity based on the age. So if a person is 20 years old and you do the electroshock, this is how long it is. If a person is 70 years old, this is the length. So the longer the electroshock is based on how old you are.
So 2/3 of the recipients of electroshock are women. Something like 3/4 of them are over the age of 60. I think the oldest person to receive electroshock was 104.
Early death is not limited to the elderly. A large study of over 3,000 ECT patients found that ECT recipients of all ages had an increased death rate, no matter what the cause. Even the American Psychiatric Association reports that ECT kills. However, they claim it's only 1 in 10,000 patients. A guess made by Richard Abrams, the psychiatrist who manufactures and sells ECT machines. The actual numbers, the state of Texas reports that 1 out of 350 died within 2 weeks after receiving ECT. That's 50 times higher than the US murder rate and 30 times higher than the APA's claim. Even when patients refuse ECT, in most places in the world, they are still not safe.
So if a person determines, I don't want ECT, the psychiatrist can actually go to a judge who can determine that he's not competent to make his own medical decisions and override his own decision about what he wants done to himself and his body, and actually deliver him electroconvulsive therapy against his will.
I was assigned to a psychiatrist who was very aggressive in his manner in trying to get me to agree to do ECT. You know, I was skeptical and I said, no, I don't want to do it. The psychiatrist pretty much threatened me. He said that if I don't agree to it, then they can get a court order. My family actually sided with me. They said that they shouldn't do this to me against my wishes. Basically, all the doctors said that I needed to have ECT and that I was not in my right mind to refuse. The probate court judge agreed with them and he issued the court order, and that was how they started the forced ECT on me. I was pretty much tortured. I was being forced to have this treatment. I didn't like it, I didn't want it, and when I was honest with the doctors about how it affected me and I told them, they just interpreted that as part of my depression. I realized that the only way to stop this was to start lying, so that's what I did. What was done to me was really, frankly, evil. It's a barbaric treatment, and that it shouldn't be done to people against their will like it was done to me.
With psychiatry, like most of their treatments, these are frequently given without consent of the patient because it is the only quote-unquote medical field where their authority supersedes your rights, an individual's rights to consent to treatment.
If it breaks their skin like an injection, or if it's a drug that you feed into them one way or another, or if it's electroshock therapy, that is violating a person's sovereignty over his own body. A person has a right to their own body. They have a right not to be violated.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture is very definite in his condemnation of coercive ECT.
Against your will, electroshock therapy is, in my opinion, absolutely prohibited. I have seen so many persons who have been subjected to electroshocks in order to extract a confession or information, etc. And it's one of the worst feelings of pain you can imagine if this electric current is really runs through your body. So it's the contractions. It might even lead to death. In my opinion, they are torture.
And some of ECT's earliest uses were quite literally torture. During the Nazi era, German psychiatrists administered lethal bouts of ECT to mental patients they deemed unfit for life. In the 1950s Algerian War, psychiatrists gave electroshock to prisoners before questioning them. The CIA trained Moroccan security services in the use of an electroshock machine for interrogations. Psychiatrists in the Soviet Union used electroshock to punish political dissidents who refused to toe the party line.
In South Africa, ECT was used as a torturous method of treatment for a group that mental health considered to be animals, because they actually had the idea that if you were black, you couldn't feel pain.
One of the original ECT devices, which was actually manufactured in the UK, called the Page Russell, was used for torture in Arabic countries and was used on political prisoners. So how do you call something help or treatment when it's been used for torture?
Psychiatrists also put electroshock to use in the field of so-called mind control.
In a moment, we will examine the closest experimentation to brainwashing that we have uncovered.
Infamous psychiatrist Ewan Cameron conducted experiments putting people into a coma-like deep sleep using drugs and extreme high-voltage electroshock and reducing them to an infantile state.
I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody could give to anybody in the world.
An avid proponent of Cameron's treatment was Australian psychiatrist Harry Bailey.
Dr. Harry Bailey studied a treatment called deep sleep therapy, and it involved knocking a person unconscious with a cocktail of psychiatric drugs, usually barbiturates and sedative hypnotics. And while they were in that comatose state, they were given electroshock treatment, sometimes twice daily. The patients were dying. There were 48 deaths. Over 1,100 patients were subjected to this. They all had brain damage. They all had personality changes. They had blood clots. They were seriously damaged by this so-called treatment.
Tonight, why was deep sleep therapy ever allowed to happen at Chelmsford?
The analogy with the appalling medical experimentation by Nazi doctors is difficult to avoid.
Certainly the information that we gave to the Attorney General's Department showed clearly that very often patients were given electric shock treatment without their consent.
The question has remained ever since then, why hasn't the matter been satisfactorily resolved?
CCHR, along with the Chelmsford Victims Action Group, got local media. There were demonstrations on the steps of Parliament demanding a government inquiry into deep sleep treatment. And we worked with legislators and we agitated for reforms, and it actually produced some of the biggest reforms Australia's ever seen.
Good evening. There will be a royal commission into the controversial Chelmsford Hospital deep sleep treatment.
Let me tell you that this royal commission will get to the bottom of all of the abuses that have gone on in the system.
And it was through our investigations, through the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, working with patients and their families who had undergone this deep sleep treatment, we ended up having deep sleep treatment banned.
Today, psychiatrists are targeting shock treatment on new population segments. Pregnant women are now told that ECT is safe for them and their unborn child.
When a woman is pregnant, she shouldn't drink coffee, she's not supposed to smoke. There's a whole list of things that are bad for the baby when it's in the prenatal stage. However, pregnant women are getting electroshock, causing miscarriages.
It boggles the mind that something like this can be given to a woman who is growing a baby in her body, that of course the electricity is going to affect her and her unborn child.
Children are an increasing target for ECT psychiatrists.
It's a horrible idea to give electroconvulsive therapy to children. We don't know what the long-term effects are, but it only makes sense that repeated seizures like that could cause cognitive difficulties, learning difficulties, and damage to the nervous system as it's developing.
If you're going to destroy an adult brain, just think what you could do with a child brain. You could do much more damage. Take away his whole future.
There is a very good scientific reason for why children should never undergo ECT.
In a fully matured brain, there are between 60 and 90 billion nerve cells. And when they die, they are not replaced. But in children, the brain is still developing. So if a cell is killed in an adult, that is one less brain cell the person has to operate with. But if a cell is killed in a child, then not only does he lose that cell, but he loses all the other cells that cell would have created during the development of the brain. So ECT is more dangerous to children even than it is to adults.
Right now in the United States, through Freedom of Information Act, CCHR has uncovered the fact that 16 states are currently electroshocking children and adolescents, and 5 of those states are electroshocking children aged 0 to 5.
Psychiatrists give electroshock to children all over the world. In Australia, children as young as 4 receive electroshock. In Turkey, 9-year-old children receive it explicitly as a punishment.
I'm an ex-law enforcement officer. Much milder things can land people in jail than to send a child through that type of trauma. We have a society where a parent can't even spank a child, but psychiatrists can put 400 volts through the brain of a child.
Under the definition, it's abuse in no other way. You are inflicting harm to a child under the guise of treatment.
The World Health Organization issued a strong injunction that there are no indications for the use of ECT on minors, and hence, this should be prohibited through legislation. Yet both the president and the CEO of the American Psychiatric Association have formally urged the head of the FDA to make ECT broadly available to children and adolescents of all ages. It's a campaign aimed at our most defenseless, with little government oversight.
One of the things that the marketing campaign does so brilliantly is to talk about electroshock as a treatment of last resort. That is what we call a lie. There are psychiatrists in the States who recommend electroshock for all sorts of things, including inscriptions like autism, ADHD, learning disability, and they recommend that that is the first treatment that people are given, not the last, not the end of the line.
Today, in the United States, federal regulations require all device manufacturers to report adverse events from ECT. But machine makers rarely ever comply.
So you have manufacturers that know about adverse events, that have logs of adverse events, that didn't report adverse events to the FDA. And the FDA has done very little to actually enforce those regulations.
And when they do report, it has taken as long as 17 years. And those that get through are often gruesome. Strokes, catatonia, a fetus killed, a man's head on fire, and these are just a few.
My husband Jose Topete had ECT. They told us what a great thing it was and how it was going to help our family and help Jose. Jose had 23 treatments of ECT, and during the ECT treatments, he did not get better at any time. In fact, he had a breakdown at one time after the first week of ECT. We didn't realize that his whole memory was gone until after ECT was over. And one of the just terrible times was we live in a rural area that has a pond, and we have lots of frogs and bullfrogs. Well, we heard the frogs making a lot of racket, and Jose said, "What's that noise?" And we said, "Oh, it's just the frogs." And he said, "What's a frog?" He doesn't know his parents. He doesn't know his siblings. He has no memory of our marriage, the birth of his children, taking care of his family, his job. He was a California state tax auditor. He had no memory of what California tax law was. Everything was wiped out of his mind. His children, me, he didn't know who we were. At first I thought, okay, we'll be able to just teach him who we are and make him love us again. And that didn't work like that. It's been a real heartbreak for all of us.
With all the damage it has caused, the ECT machine has never been properly regulated.
What we have here is a basic electronic device. It generates pulses for the purpose of delivering an electric shock. There's nothing medical about it, it's just a pulse generator.
This ECT machine was bought online. No license, no background checks, no questions asked, just a credit card.
In 1976, the United States Food and Drug Administration was given authority by Congress to regulate devices such as these. This device, of course, was never tested by the FDA because it's too old. This one was used starting in the 1940s. When the FDA gained control over these devices, they didn't start regulating ECT devices because they were already in use. Any device that was already being used did not need to be tested, as long as it's substantially equivalent to the devices that were used when the FDA took control.
The FDA allowed it to be grandfathered in, meaning it didn't require any proof of efficacy or clinical trials for safety and efficacy. They just let it stay on the market.
So now, psychiatrists had it both ways. On the one hand, they claimed that shock machines were substantially equivalent to those of the 1940s, while at the same time, they marketed ECT as modern and new and improved, a transparent deception. But in 1979, the FDA classified the ECT machine as a Class 3 device, meaning it is high risk and must be safety tested. The FDA gave manufacturers 3 years to try to prove them safe.
So, if ECT wants to claim safety and effectiveness, they should be showing by clinical studies that it's safe and effective. They haven't. And it isn't because they can't afford to. There's plenty of their own consultants that work for big league universities that get plenty of funding to do it. They choose not to because ECT is not effective.
Has Somatics ever conducted any studies to determine whether any brain injury could be caused by ECT?
Somatics has never conducted any studies of any kind. We're not in the business of doing studies of traumatic brain injury. We sell thymotrons.
To avoid any chance of testing, psychiatrists have lobbied the FDA to reclassify the machines as Class 2, a category that includes other such items as syringes, contact lenses, and condoms.
There's nothing else in Class 2 that causes brain damage, cardiac standstill, stroke, brain hemorrhage, seizures. It's really ridiculous for them to even be considered as Class 2. The reason they want to put the ECT machine in Class 2 is because it wouldn't have to be tested for safety or effectiveness.
Due to public outcry, the FDA scheduled a hearing to determine the validity of reclassification. ECT survivors flew to Washington to testify.
I argued with a psychiatrist and he dumped me in the locked ward and shocked me 5 times. I became violent. I tore my nails off, dragged him under the door. And he said after 5 times, he said, sometimes they don't help you.
I had over 80 shock treatments. And yes, they called them maintenance treatments, but I don't remember my wedding day. I don't remember my husband putting a ring on my finger.
When I was given an IQ test a few months after the ECT and asked the population of the United States, I answered 1,000. When he asked me to guess again, I answered 2,000. I remember having no idea where to find the answer in my head.
The advisory panel largely agreed that ECT machines should remain in Class 3 and undergo safety testing. But the FDA, represented by Jeffrey Shuren and his colleague Malvina Edelman, ignored the panel's recommendations and broadened the use of the ECT machine as a Class 2 device.
3,000 submissions were sent into the Food and Drug Administration talking about the destructiveness of electroshock. The FDA and the APA and other psychiatrists want to make ECT more broadly available, despite the fact that all these people are saying no, despite tens of thousands of people saying electroshock is damaging, that it can actually kill you, that it destroys their life.
I recently started ECT treatments, electroconvulsive therapy. I was supposed to have one today, but I went ahead and canceled it. Because I'm stupid now. Or I'm definitely not as smart as I used to be. Spent a lot of time and money on education because I wanted to be smart. And I was smart. I don't remember anything anymore. Right now, this is my life. it's not on the sheet. I'm not remembering it. When it came to ECT, it was out of sheer desperation. And I didn't research it. And I just trusted. And now that I'm where I am, I don't have the brain capacity to research it. It's too late.
Psychiatrists and ECT machine makers are well aware of the damage they create. So why do they keep doing it?
We look at the cost of manufacturing one of these machines. It has 3 of these transformers. They might be $40 a piece. And these parts probably could be collected for a total of about $50 or $60 for the components. The printed circuit board could probably be manufactured for less than $100 in quantity. All of these resistors are pennies a piece, and the integrated circuits are normally less than $1 a piece. So we see here a device that could be manufactured in quantity for between $500 and $1,000, including parts and labor.
And with ECT systems selling for up to nearly $20,000, the markup is huge. In addition, psychiatrists benefit handsomely from prescribing ECT because they must be present and therefore paid for all electroshock sessions.
It costs about $2,500 per session. So if you do the math, and let's just say for simple mathematics, the person has 10 sessions initially, that's $25,000.
Inpatient costs are even more profitable, netting as high as $120,000 per patient.
We would start usually around 6 a.m. We would see up to 13 patients a day. It was almost like an assembly line mentality, kind of get them in, get them worked up, get the treatment, and get them out, get the next one in, get the treatment, do the recovery, get them out. It was a very lucrative business. Big money maker.
Psychiatrists performing electroshock rake in an average of twice those who don't. And they can achieve this income by working only a few hours a week.
It's been calculated that in America, psychiatrists doing a relatively small amount of electroshock, possibly 20 sessions a week, will earn anything up to an additional $300,000 per year.
And with 100,000 Americans a year given ECT, psychiatrists have created a $5.4 billion shock empire in the US alone. More money than the national budget of over half the countries on Earth.
It has nothing to do with medicine. It has nothing to do with helping the patients. It's just a money machine.
With so much money to be made, the shock industry is rife with conflicts of interest. The face of these conflicts, psychologist and avid ECT promoter, Harold Sackheim.
Has any manufacturer of ECT devices ever given you money?
I've received reimbursements and honoraria.
How much money have you received?
$10,000, maybe $15,000, $20,000, $20,000, $25,000, $70,000.
In addition, Sackheim has received at least $9 million in government grant money to research ECT. A conflict of interest that leads back to the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, where its director of ECT research, psychiatrist Matthew Rudorfer, oversees its grants. Not only has Rudorfer been showering money on Harold Sackheim's institutions for years, the duo co-wrote a chapter of an ECT textbook. Also at NIMH is Sarah Lisenby. she has had financial ties to 10 different psychiatric device makers. Her mentor was Harold Sackheim. Then there's the American Psychiatric Association's Richard Weiner. Weiner was the lead psychiatrist on the APA task force that recommended taking brain damage off the APA's ECT consent form with these words: brain damage need not be included as a potential risk. Weiner was also a consultant for the 2 top American ECT machine manufacturers, Mecta and Somatics. Somatics is owned by shock psychiatrists Richard Abrams and Conrad Swartz, who charge up to $20,000 for an ECT system. Richard Weiner's APA Task Force report on ECT cited over 60 of Abrams' articles. And all of the key players in this entangled web of corruption are editorial board members of the Journal of ECT. Abrams, Swartz, Lisenby, Weiner, Sackheim, Rudorfer, Kellner, and Fink.
When you invite the foxes to watch the hen house and act like you're really guarding the place, well, it's really just a violation of public trust.
And people's lives are being destroyed.
I had problems before I had shock treatments, and I would say I have more problems now.
I didn't receive any help from the ECT that the psychiatrist gave me. It destroys you.
Shock treatment felt like torture to me. I say it's like torture. It felt like it destroyed my spirit.
It beat all the abuse I even experienced. It beat the rapings, the molestations, it beat everything. Because it did so much to me psychologically and physically.
Prior to ECT, I never thought about suicide. After the second round of ECT, I definitely was considering it.
ECT stands for electroconvulsive torture. Because obviously, it didn't help my sister at all.
Psychiatry destroyed my father because it destroyed his purpose, and he committed suicide in the end.
Is it the responsibility of the psychiatrist performing ECT to make sure that no harm comes to his patient?
The answer to that is no.
In the last hour, psychiatrists have administered over 1,000 shocks. Their victims total 1 million people worldwide every year. And with shock doctors working hard to eliminate restrictions on ECT, no one is safe.
It's unconscionable, some of the things that I've seen, particularly as it pertains to very small children.
The way they've treated people is just unbelievable. I couldn't see treating my worst enemy that way.
Oh my God, I don't want that to happen to anybody. It brings tears to my eyes. It's frightening.
Just common sense will tell you that you don't need to put that electricity to their brain. I'm adamantly opposed.
There is only one solution for ECT, a treatment that is nothing short of electrocution.
It's a complete travesty as a civilized society to do these type of torturous, barbaric procedures.
ECT has to be stopped. We cannot continue to do this to people. We have safe and effective treatments that are out there. We do not need ECT.
It's just cruel and inhumane to be able to send people through that type of torture.
We're standing up and saying that this experimental dosing with ECT cannot occur anymore.
It's just assault and battery.
It's more torture than it is a medical treatment.
It should be illegal.
ECT should be banned.
ECT should have been banned 50 years ago. The sooner the better.
It can be done. ECT has already been fully or partially banned in several states and countries around the world.
We got rid of the lobotomy because it was such an abhorrent image and it was so obviously a form of torture and assault. Electroshock is equally a form of torture and assault. We just haven't gotten rid of it yet. And we need to take action and require the FDA to ban this device, which has never been proven safe or effective.
This is an atrocity that should never have got as far as it has. It's just a mass experimentation, and the FDA does nothing. They need to be held accountable.
ECT needs to be exposed as torture and a barbaric violation of human rights. Our future depends on it. Join the Citizens Commission on Human Rights in calling electroshock out for what it is, a crime against humanity. If you or anyone you know has been harmed by shock treatment, or if you want to do something about it, take action and speak out. Contact CCHR.
Thank you.